the title is Death and Impermanence, and you could look at this as death, impermanence, death, or impermanence, death, impermanence, whichever way you look at it, they go so well. And, you know, the impact of a death, the impact of somebody dying, just brings all of that up, you know, death and impermanence. So I'm going to break my presentation into 4 sections. First one, death in my life and how the Dharma and Sangha helped. Secondly, examples of the uncertainty of the time of death. Thirdly, what may happen when we die. And fourthly, some sayings and a little story that may give us encouragement and support. Yeah. So when I first came along to the movement, I had a tremendous fear of death and a tremendous fear of my emotional life. The latter being a fear of expressing myself fully to men and to women. Yeah, and in terms of death, that went right back to the time I reckon I was a baby. Nightmares used to terrify me. Living in houses where people had died before frightened me. Even living next door to a house where somebody had died and where the body might still be there. I had a tremendous fear of coffins. I remember being on a boys' brigade holiday in Bruges in Belgium, and there the undertakers had big glass windows, you know, like they were ahead of their time in terms of presentation. And they'd put their, you know, their best coffin in the window, and that used to terrify me. And I remember one night I was out for a walk on my own as a teenager, and I just needed to duck my head almost and run past this big window. It was just too much to take in. Yeah, I reckon the cause of my fear was the year before I was born. My mother gave birth to a son, to Alex, who died 3 weeks after birth from pneumonia on his own in a small hospital in a town not far from where my parents and my elder sister lived. I was born a year later and so many weeks, and I reckon I picked up their concerns and no doubt my sister's concerns. I bet she was thrilled to have a little baby brother. Yeah. As well as the fear, I remember as a child having a curiosity in death. And this is when I was living in Aden. So I left Aden when I was 11. Well, it was Little Aden we lived in, and that's in South Arabia. And a young woman died in Aden. And at school, I remember talking to friends, what would happen to her, what would happen to the body, where it would go, this, that, and the other. And I returned home from school. My mum was in the kitchen. I think she was making crisps. And I just sat on the table and started chatting about the ideas that I'd been talking to friends about. And she was so shocked. She says, wait till your dad comes home, you know, you're in for trouble. But thank goodness my dad said nothing. He said nothing. In 1974, at the age of 21, I came across the FWBO. And I was just so glad to come across this movement. It was a movement where all issues could be talked about, whether it was sex, whether it was money, whether it was death, you know, the sort of no-go areas that had been such a big part of my life up till then. Never mind the Dharma, which I'd already been turned on to by the talk Chintamani gave at the church before I came along. Well, it was the youth fellowship. He wasn't in the pulpit. So yeah, I just very, very, very moved by that. Also moved in those early days, listening to cassettes of Bante's lectures, and where Bante just encouraged in one particular talk, the curiosity, the inquiry, and the exploration of death, to lean into it. That's what Buddhists did. Seems as though Christians in his day in Kalimpong sort of pushed it away, but Buddhists inquire and look into it. And then in 1981, some 7 years after coming along, an order member called Vangisa died. he had a heart attack, and the same evening he came home to tell his wife that he'd just received funding for the city lit Buddhism course that he used to run every year. Yeah, so he was thrilled. So he died, and his body was sent to the West Middlesex Hospital. I went with an order member friend, Kula Deva, who's since resigned, and he's died actually. I ended up seeing Vangesa's body in the mortuary, and I'd never stood next to a dead body, and his was pulled out on a tray. Actually, there were a lot of bodies there, but I focused on Vangesa's, and I remember touching him, touching his hands, his head. He was a friend. I went there because he was a friend. He was in his late 50s, and on the way home from on my own, sitting on the bus, I just had this strong feeling that I really wanted to live my life truly, deeply, the way I wanted to live it. At that point, I was a mitra. I'd asked for ordination, but I'd been listening a lot to others and maybe not enough to myself, to my deeper self. And that was a real turning point. Vangesa's death was a tremendous turning point, not just to me, but to many other in the movement. I think it was the first major death that had an impact on the London people at the London Buddhist Centre and myself. Okay. So in terms of the second area, the uncertainty of the time of death, the examples I'd like to give, the first one really is, somebody who never saw birth. She had a tremendous problem with her spine and brain, and her life was shortened by those at Colchester Hospital. And I was asked to come along to give a ceremony to Athena Sky and her parents and her mum's mother at the hospital, which I did. And then later I took the funeral for Athena Sky at Colchester Crematorium. All these examples, I can say a lot more, but I'll keep it brief. My mother's death in 1981, in the November, Vangesa died in the February. That had a really big impact on me and showed me the importance of the Dharma in my life and how it allowed me to say things to my mother and be with my mother that I felt gave her support. One thing was, as she was dying in the days before she died, I remember holding her hand and just saying to her that she was like an old soldier, and what she needed was a new body. And she agreed with me. So we never talked about what was on its way, but we both knew. Yeah. A good friend of mine, Arthur Darshan, he was in ideal conditions at our retreat center at Guhyaloka. We are very, very close friends. We used to share the same room, work in the same business. And I was one of his main first contacts when he came along, a little bit stoned, having spent many months in India. But we were dear friends, and he was out for a run. He'd been on solitary retreat in Guhyaloka. A good friend of his, Prakashas, was on doing a solitary retreat as well. And he went for an early morning run to warm up, and he collapsed and died close to the retreat center where there was an ordination retreat going on. One of Swadeepa and Charamani's dear friends, Vajrasiddhi, was there at the time, who knew about medical things very well and went to try and save Arthur Darshan, but he couldn't be saved. He died, and there was no medical history of heart problems, and he died of heart failure. The other example is Manjushra, another dear friend, who 10 months before this, whilst at Wyndham, we were walking away from the cricket pavilion, and he said to me, "Harshaprabha, when I die, will you take my funeral?" And I said to Manjushra, I said, "I will, providing I'm alive at the time." So, but 10 months later, he's on a retreat at Dana Kosha. Well, he's leading a retreat, wolf at the door, with his dear friend Ananda, he's the oldest order member that we have in our movement. They were in a team meeting. They'd had a bit of an argument, maybe a strong argument beforehand. And Manjushra had a stroke. And a few days later, he died at a major hospital in Edinburgh. And he gave a number of his organs to others. But yeah, I did. I co-led his funeral with 2 other order members, Sadhanandi and Taravajra, both dear friends of his. And then there was Sudarshan, a key order member in the Indian ordination process, the development of the movement in India. We struck up a friendship when I was in India in 1980, and also with his wife. And Sudarshan had just been to the USA to see his 2 children there, was in Europe. I had an email from him on the 27th of June 2009, where he was rejoicing in our friendship and valuing the work I'd done for the Dharma, I was doing for the Dharma. And then on the 6th of July, on returning to India, on his way home in a taxi that they didn't normally take, he was killed along with Bodhisaki, who was not long ordained, his wife, as the taxi went under the back of a large truck. And that was really shocking for me. I thought the Dharma gave me privilege. You know, it gave me privilege. If I was practicing, something like this would never happen to me. Yeah. And lastly, you know, this just came as a shock, as life seemed brilliant for him from a text the night before this happened, on New Year's Day, on 1st of July 2019. A dear friend of mine in Canada, he was at friends, had a brilliant evening. And then the next day, Kerry took his own life. And the image I had of Kerry after hearing that was of tangled electric wire. It's like everything was tangled in him. And I had the odd experience of standing by my car before leaving work that day, not knowing what had happened at all. But I just stood and looked at my car and I thought, you know, in a sense, you know, what's this all about? You know, what's this worth? What's this all about? Words to that effect. And I didn't know what had happened till about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night when I opened my emails. So when we look at dying, some of this I've gleaned through speaking with Bhante. When we look at dying, and obviously from what is very accessible, what may happen? Yeah, and what may support it? Well, the obvious thing is that our senses shut down. Maybe it's not obvious, but our senses shut down. And the last sense that goes is hearing. Yeah, so be very cautious if you're around somebody who's dying to what you say and talk about. And that's even after they've died, I would think. Yeah, even after they've died. And then we let go of the body. But talking to Bhante a little while back, you know, he sort of thought we still might feel we had a body, but eventually that will go. Eventually that will go. And then, you know, well, when we die, we're in the space between death and rebirth, and that's called, you know, a bardo. Those spaces are bardos. We have bardo of life, bardo of dreams, etc. There are these different bardos, and there's the intermediate stages. Yeah, and then we might, out of compulsion, we have this wish to have a human body. Yeah, so we're compelled to be reborn. Spiritually advanced people are reborn out of compassion. But I think for most of us, we'll be reborn out of compulsion. Yeah. So what may support us in our awareness of death and dying? Well, I'd say applying metta and mindfulness to the persons or persons that are poorly and are dying, and the dead person too. You know, take the situation fully in hand, bring our awareness fully there. Secondly, take the opportunity to see somebody who's died, to be with them, and meditate with the dead person if you feel up to it, yeah? And for me, when I'm with somebody, especially a dear person who's died, I always feel the compulsion to touch the body. Yeah, and that happened with Manjushra at his ceremony before his funeral. The ceremony was the night before. I think I was one of the first to touch his hand and forehead. Yeah. And if you're ever asked to take a funeral, take the opportunity. Do take the opportunity. Yeah. It's such a key element that's often just sort of brushed under the carpet. No, I was really pleased at being at Andy's mum's funeral just before the lockdown, and the way that was held. It was very, very good, very moving. Yeah. And for me, the first funeral I took was a 36-year-old Chinese restaurant worker called Mr. NG. He died in his early 30s, and I co-led that with Kema Vera. So it was a Chinese funeral with a twist of Western Buddhism. And there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'll leave it there. But I was very glad to do it. Yeah. Yes, do keep people in mind after they've died as well in a metaphor way. Gemma died not so long ago, and, from our Sangha. And I'd like to think a lot of us bring Gemma to mind every day. It might just be for a second or two every day, but, do bring her to mind, because metta, or goodwill, encouragement, there is no end to it in a way. And I sort of feel it still has a good effect. I bring her to mind every day. Yeah. Fifthly, are we open to spiritual death, the death that comes about through change in our spiritual life, to move on? Sixthly, are we open to letting go, just letting go? It seems though the Buddha's path to enlightenment and to enlightenment itself, according to Sagramati, was about letting go, yeah? Letting go of what? Possessions maybe, habits, views, as Charamani's already said, negative mental states, yeah? Seventhly, think about writing your own will and funeral arrangements. They are separate documents. You can have your funeral arrangements. You can have your own funeral arrangements separate to them in your house. Lastly, some sayings that may give us encouragement and support. Bante's reply to me when I asked if Arthur Darshan had a good death, he said yes, because he worked on himself hard spiritually, or words to that effect. So basically he was working hard spiritually on himself. Another one of Bante's, death is an enforced period of meditation. And the other one, from Bante, if you've had a good life, you'll have a good death. And lastly, a short story, if I can have a minute. It's from a friend in Canada who was sitting on a deck with a male friend, Teresa, and a male friend was sitting on a deck, summer's day, and in front of them was Teresa's 3-year-old daughter, stroking the cat, sunny day. At a certain point, the little daughter lifts her head up and says, "Mummy, I'm so glad I chose you as my mummy." That's what she said. "I'm so glad I chose you as my mummy." Teresa replied, "I'm so glad you chose me as your mummy." And she replied, "Yes, when I was looking down, I thought I would like to live with those two people." Thank you.